Let me introduce you and just welcome you to this discussion.
Thank you, Jack.
We're really grateful that you've come along here today. We're going to use this discussion to talk a bit about EU policies around animal rights and how it intersects with the realities. So you're Ruud Tombrock. You are the Executive Director for Humane World for Animals Europe. Let's start with a couple of direct questions just to get a bit of a sense of where we're at. When we talk about animal welfare in Europe, are you hopeful or are you despairing?
Bit of both, Jack. Bit of both, to be honest. So I'm hopeful if I look at the people, the citizens in Europe, who more and more care about animals, and not only their companion animals, but also animals used in farming for food, animals used in testing, wildlife. People have extended their compassion and care for animals. So that's what makes me hopeful. What makes me way less hopeful is what is going on in geopolitics at the moment. I see more and more governments introducing very protectionist measures to protect their industry, the commercial sector, their economies, and that does not make our lives easier, because what we see is that animal welfare is being pushed down on the priority ladder.
We'll get into that a little bit more. Let's have another quick question. Scale of 1 to 10. On that scale, how much do you trust the European Union? We're here in Brussels. How much do you trust the EU to fulfill its promises it made to end caging of animals?
On a scale 1 to 10. 6.
Good. We're going to get into that a bit more later and find out why you put that in. Okay, personally, if you weren't doing this job, defending the rights of animals, what would you do?
I would either be working for a humanitarian organization, or I would be running a coffee bar.
Oh, nice. So, Humane World for Animals, you're active across all animal welfare issues. You run a number of campaigns, and we won't have time to get into all of them now. But let's pick up on a couple of them. And I think an interesting place maybe to start is the work on disasters and what happens to animals there. Not always the most talked about, but things like floods, things like fires, animals are really affected by these things. What are the problems that are faced by organizations trying to save animals in these situations?
Yeah, and thank you very much for that question, because it's a theme that is very much now with the climate change and the number of natural disasters increasing, including in Europe. Think about the floods that you referred to, but also forest fires. We see more and more of that. And I think that the main problem is that we are not well prepared. We are not well prepared as a society to also think and care for animals. So what you see as a very concrete example of something that happened recently with the floods in Central Europe, in Poland, the government asked people in the disaster areas to evacuate, and the fire brigade was starting to do that. But the fire brigade was not ready to also transport companion animals, dogs and cats, and sometimes people have a couple of chickens in the garden or a pig. They were not ready to do that, not able to do it. So, and that for many people caused a very difficult situation, because then they had to choose, what am I going to do? Am I going to leave my animals here and go with the fire brigade, or am I staying here? But you also see it, for example, in temporary shelter. People who are being evacuated have to go to an emergency location, cannot always take their animal. Animal protection organizations that cannot enter a disaster area to provide help, support, expertise on caring for wildlife or farm animals.
Because they're not considered like fundamentally important, vital services in these situations.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, if important or not. The reality is that we have protocols in place to deal with, to respond to emergencies. The authorities, local authorities, national authorities, the EU has disaster legislation in place, but often animals are being forgotten. And I think that to go back to the natural disasters, I think the EU is a bit behind other parts of the world that have unfortunately, more experience with hurricanes or tornadoes or floods. For us, it's relatively new, and it's time to act and make sure that animals are being included in legislation and in protocols.
So what is that action? You say being included in legislation. What kinds of changes need to be made, and how do you do it? Is it because it sort of feels like it should be common sense in some senses?
Yeah. I think you're right on that. It is a lot of common sense, but it also will help to include the animals in legislation, because that will make it a topic that needs to be addressed. So the national authorities will then have to make sure that in protocols, in emergency situations, that the animals are not being forgotten, that they are prepared for the situation, that there are farm animals or companion animals that need to be taken care of. So it helps to include the animals in legislation, but it's not just that. It's also, you need to translate that legislation into emergency protocols, but there's also a responsibility of the owner, the animal owner. If you're a farmer and you have a piece of land next to a river, and that river could flood, then I think you have a responsibility, owning those animals, to take good care of them and make sure that there is something that you do, either evacuate or something else, when disaster strikes.
So that comes down to sort of responsibility. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Who is responsible for this? And when you
all
talk
of us is my answer.
But when you talk about the protocols that are implemented, which would include then bringing in animal rescue organisations or organisations that are able to deal with large-scale evacuations, what happens if those protocols aren't followed? How do you envisage that working?
In my experience, protocols are usually followed. So, but the protocols at the moment are insufficient. They do not include the animals. They say, okay, well, if the river floods, then the Red Cross has a role to play, and we'll do this and that, and then there's those buildings will be emergency temporary shelter accommodation for people. That is all taken care of, but the animals are often forgotten for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think it's something that touches people. When we talk about this, I immediately start thinking about what I would do with my dog at home. Right. So it is a way that can be compelling to people, right? The story around this can be compelling.
I think so. We've studied. There has been quite a bit of psychological studies done, also after Katrina, where this was an issue too. On the psychological effects of people having to leave their animal behind, and that is it's a big thing. It impacts people's lives for years, and so I think all of us, we need to take better care of it.
What's your policy call here? What would you, as Humane World for Animals, call to be done?
Well, there's several. I think it's at several levels that something needs to happen. The EU should include animals in legislation, and that will also make it easier to fund activities to prepare for a situation where there's a flood or a forest fire. National authorities should do something similar on their plans and national legislation, and then the municipalities who have their emergency protocols should also. It's all about being prepared. If you're well prepared and the protocols are sound, then there's not that issue that we are now experiencing over the past few years.
Interesting. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about animal testing. So if we're talking a little bit about animal testing and moving on to that, it's one of the issues where the European Union actually has a lot of influence in lawmaking, and about 95% is EU legislation on this. How quickly is the transition towards animal-free testing happening in Europe, from your understanding as an organisation?
Right. How quickly?
How quickly? How efficiently?
The short answer is slowly, Jack. Very slow. It's a very slow process. And luckily we see in some countries, and my own country, the Netherlands, is I think a good example, where the government has set up project teams to accelerate the pace, moving towards the non-animal methods. But in general, it's a very, very slow.
Is this scientific? I mean, there are good enough alternatives, right? And we understand that, and other global partners are already doing
yes,
that. There are good examples.
There are. So if you look, for example, at the situation in the United States on the testing, the safety testing of chemicals, the United States have completely turned around their approach. They were testing on animals too, and they said, "Oh, we need a completely different approach because people want it. People don't want animals to suffer for this. Certainly not if there are very sound, very good non-animal methods as an alternative." So the United States changed their approach, and now the number of animals being used in the safety testing of chemicals in the US has dropped incredibly. But here in the EU, it's difficult, but people want it. So we have seen European Citizens Initiative. We have a European Parliament that has said, okay, and now phase out of the animal test, because there are plenty of other methods that are just as safe or even safer than the tests with the animals available. So move there.
But they don't do it. Like you say, there was a vote in the European Parliament,
right,
a resolution
right.
that called for this.
Right.
What's the blockage, and how does it get unblocked?
I think it's a system that is a bit stuck at the moment. So what we all can quickly, everyone that you talk with, everybody agrees, animal testing should be the last resort. Right. So first you try other methods, and then if there's nothing else available, then you do the animal test. Everybody agrees on that. Animal tests are last resort. But if you don't invest in non-animal methods, if you don't test them out, if you don't develop them, if you don't if your innovation is going very, very slow, if the regulators are not looking at that with an open eye and say, okay, well, maybe we should look at those other methods. If you don't do that, then you will end up in a situation when there is no other way, and then the animal test is continuing to be the last resort.
The last and the first resort.
Right. It's the only thing that people can do. And so if you don't invest in innovation, then your system is stuck. And it's regulators that I think can do a little bit more, looking at alternatives for specific tests. But it's also, I spoke with a scientist not so long ago who said, yeah, but I'm not being taken seriously with my research if I have not tested it on animals. So there is something in the scientific world too that needs to make that change. And it is possible, because examples like in the US, we've seen in other parts of the world too. And in the EU on cosmetics testing, we've done it too.
How does that mentality shift happen then? how do we get people to believe this scientist that you were speaking to? You mentioned regulators. What could they do to change the mindsets?
It's also the regulators that need to change the mindset
themselves, right? As well,
right. So I think again an open eye to what the people want, right? It's the citizens who want this change. So an open eye and look at There are so many on chemicals safety testing. There are so many tests, and we as an organization we're happy to provide the regulators with a short list with easy wins for them to move out of the test with animals that is still required at the moment, and to move to a perfectly safe other method without using the animals. So test by test. Go there and make the change.
Can you give us any bad examples of this? Are there any sort of issues which are really bad at the moment that could quickly be resolved?
Well, I think the LD50 test, if you're familiar with that, the lethal dose 50 test. So it's a test where you determine the dose that is required to kill half of the animal population that you're using in the test. So you're testing different doses on different groups of animals, and then the lethal dose 50 is okay. So
and this is for drugs that are used on humans.
Drugs, but also chemicals. It's a test that has been developed 100 years ago. Next year, 2027, it will be the 100-year anniversary. So, and it doesn't make any sense anymore. But still, people are using it. Luckily, in the EU, not that much, but in other parts of the world, people are, and it doesn't make sense because there are so many alternatives available.
And so just removing that or banning that as a practice or a scientific benchmark within legislation?
There are, for all these tests, there are tests available just as safe or even safer because, and it has been said before, the body of a mouse is only to some extent comparable to the body of a human being. So, and other approaches are sometimes even safer than what we're using now in the animal test. So the alternatives are available. Go there. Act.
Let's move on now to farm animals, because this is another big topic, and it's something that the EU gets a lot of pressure for because of the amount of money that is spent EU budget-wise on agriculture. Perhaps it's one of the most heavily discussed issues. We've had a deluge of legislation over the past 5 to 10 years, and farmers are saying, listen, we can't comply with this. Lots of the regulations, they say they have a multitude of different things, but also related to climate law, and again, animal welfare sort of perhaps sinks down in the list of priorities here in Brussels. I wonder if you can just give me a bit of an assessment of the policy landscape, how workable it is, and how possible it is for farmers to improve the conditions of their livestock.
Right. Well, first of all, maybe it's good to note that there are no restrictions for farmers or even for countries to implement higher welfare standards than the EU has set. The EU is creating a level playing field, has set minimum animal welfare standards, but a farmer, an individual, or a country even can always do more. So there's no restriction there. I think what and you see that, for example, in the production of eggs, if you look at the welfare of laying hens, you already see that that move happening. There are more and more farmers moving towards cage-free systems.
Why?
You even see country because people want it.
Yeah.
Because people want
People
it.
don't buy
and
battery
right. So if you look at the supermarket eggs, it's now required that there is a number on each egg, and the number defines the housing system that the animal was in. Whether that was an enriched cage, which is only a little bit better than the battery cages that we banned in the EU, or was it an organic housing system? So people can see that, so it has been made transparent. And what you see is that more and more customers are saying, we still want the animal products, but we want the animal to have a reasonable, good life too. So I'm going to buy the eggs that I know come from housing systems that are good for the animals. So that is what is happening, has been happening. So farmers have been moving, more and more farmers have been moving towards cage-free systems, and even a number of countries have moved there. So Austria, for example, has completely banned the cage production of eggs. Luxembourg has done something similar. Germany is implementing cage-free egg production starting next year. So it's moving. So I think it's a matter of time that we'll all go there.
Outside of eggs, or do you have any good examples of the business case for farmers doing this? Any sort of specific suggestions where you know that farmers are improving their business by improving the animal welfare on their farm?
Right. So let me. What we do see is that not all farmers are moving towards cage-free systems, and I think some encouragement, some support, maybe some financial support would definitely help them to move in that direction too. But also a little bit more clarity. What we hear from food producers, farmers in particular, is that there is a lack of clarity. So where are we going? Will the whole of the European Union be cage-free on the egg production in a number of years? Because if we have that dot on the horizon, that's where we're all going. Then if I'm going to invest in a new system, then I know what system I'm going to invest in. So now it's not clear where things are going. And also farmers are not being very well supported to make that transition. And what we argue for is that in the Common Agricultural Policy funds, we will have some money allocated for farmers to make that transition easier financially, and then it will happen.
Let's talk. You mentioned there the whole of the European Union doing stuff. The European Commission did a bit of a U-turn basically on the End the Cage Age plan. Yeah. What's your assessment of that? There was a real surge towards it, and a real public sentiment, and then they jumped on it and put forward proposals, and now they've kind of withdrawn it. Perhaps you can give me your assessment of how that all went down.
Yeah, so in 2020, the previous commission announced that it was going to modernize the animal welfare legislation in the EU. These pieces of legislation have not been updated for 40 years. And in the meanwhile, there's so much more scientific knowledge available, so much research being done on the welfare of animals, what you should do, what you should not do, their natural behaviors, etc., the impact that it has on the psychology of the animal. So much more scientific research available, never been implemented in any new regulations. So the previous commission said in 2020 we're going to modernize the legislation. In 21, that same commission said, okay, we have listened to the people because a European Citizens Initiative took place, asking the Commission to come up with legislation to phase out of the cages and the crates for farm animals. And in 2021, the EU Commission said, we are listening to the people. We are taking what the citizens want seriously. We are going to introduce legislation to phase out of the cages and crates. By the end of 2023, we'll table that proposal.
Didn't happen.
And that did not happen. The reasoning that the EU Commission gave was the situation had changed. The Ukraine was mentioned there. I think that the farmers' protests must have played a role there.
But that was on a different issue. The farmers' protests.
But also,
were on
Jack,
other
if I may, but
yeah.
also there was a very heavy, aggressive lobby from the farm industry here. Very aggressive. And some of your colleagues, other journalists, have dug into that and exposed things that were disappointing. But anyhow, the conclusion was that the EU Commission said, okay, we're not going to table that proposal. Now there's a new EU Commission. The new commissioner has announced that in 2026, the modernization of the animal welfare legislation is going to be tabled again, and there's also going to be a response from the new commission on the anti-cage age wish from the citizens.
Yeah, it's really interesting because what happened in that context with the farmers' protests, they were predominantly to do with climate change regulation and also trade deals, but it meant that there was fear amongst EU legislators around a lot of different farming issues. They were concerned about poking the bear further, and I think that's what happened. So how do you, or how should the Commission think about this and prevent perhaps further delays in 2026? How confident are you? And this was back to your 6 on the scale of how much the EU can do. How does that work?
Yeah, I gave it a 6 because I cannot imagine this new commission doing nothing. Okay. They cannot afford to do nothing. It's a strong wish from the citizens in that petition, but also if you look at, for example, the results of the Eurobarometer, which was a survey, a public survey that was commissioned by the EU Commission itself in 27 EU states. People were interviewed. 84% of the respondents say that the authorities, the governments, should do more to protect the welfare of the animals used in farming. So if you look at that, plus the expectation that was raised by the previous commission, saying, yes, we hear you, citizens, we are now going to introduce and table a legislative proposal to phase out of the cages and crates, you cannot afford to do nothing.
What happens if they don't?
But that being said, I didn't give it a 9 or a 10 because I do not think that at the moment the political climate is really helping us there and is helping the Commission to say, okay, well, we're going to look at all 20 or 20 plus farm animal species, and we're going to phase out of all cages and crates for all these animals in a couple of years. I can't imagine that to happen.
What happens if it doesn't? What happens if the policies don't align with the citizens' will and the citizens' decisions?
We'll see what happens. But again, if you look at all public surveys that are taking place at the national level, but also the Eurobarometer, if you look at them and you compare the results over the years, you see the number of people that care about animals, that think that something should be done to protect their lives and protect their welfare is growing every time. You have to take that into consideration in your decisions that you're going to make. It cannot be just the industry and the commercial sector all the time.
Let's turn now to fur and the production of fur in the European Union. 16 countries have nationally banned it, and but there are still some that are continuing production. Why isn't there an all-out EU-wide ban? What should we do about countries that are continuing to produce fur in 2025?
Why there is no ban? I don't know. I hope that the current EU Commission I believe it's in March 2026 that they're going to decide on what action should be taken as a response to another European citizen initiative. Over 1.6 million people asking the Commission to introduce a ban on the fur production. So what you see is that the fur industry is an industry in decline, not just in Europe, but if you look at the global numbers, including fur production in China, including fur production in the Americas, and fur production in the EU, you see the numbers over the last decade drop. It's nothing compared to what it was 10 years ago. So and you see that in the European Union too. 16, as you said, 16 countries have banned it. 4 other countries are looking at a ban. A country like Germany has not officially banned it, but there is no fur production going on there. So I think this absolutely is just a matter of time before we all say, okay, this is not something that we want to do as humans. Treat because that's one of the most painful things to see, because these animals. These are non-domesticated animals that we're talking about. You're talking about foxes, you're talking about chinchillas, you're talking about minks. Those animals are not used to be confined in such a. It's not a pleasure for anyone, for any animal, but in particular for animals that are non-domesticated. It's very, very painful to see.
And the overwhelming public sentiment is anti-fur nowadays as well. But there is something that we can learn about fur, about campaigning. Right. You as an organisation have campaigned against fur. What have you learned about how to campaign on these issues from it?
Yeah, I think we've campaigned successfully in Italy and more recently in Romania. In Italy, a number of other NGOs had been campaigning and raising awareness for the issue for quite some time. I think one of the things that really did it in the end was an economic analysis that we had done on the size of the fur production industry in Italy, which showed that it's very small numbers, very small volumes, very small profits being made. That the majority of the fur farmers were actually people who were doing this part-time. So they had a job, and then next to it they had, as sort of a side job, they had this farm. So that made it relatively easy for the government to say, okay, now we're done with this. Now we're not accepting fur production in our country anymore. Romania was a little bit of a different situation. There was not that much awareness for the issue, so we then did via some investigations that we did. We really exposed what is happening there, what is going on, what the situation is with these animals, and that made eventually the legislators, the policymakers, take action and also go for a ban. So that those learnings, it depends a bit on the situation. I do not think that the EU Commission will need to generate more awareness for the issue. I think the awareness is there. But look at the specifics of the situations in the remaining countries that do not have a ban yet. And I think that analysis will show that it's very, that one side is animal welfare. It's a big problem. The other side is not a huge industry.
But those lessons, though, that from that fur campaigning, so exposing,
Right.
investigating, understanding, providing compelling evidence, can help on the other issues that we've talked about, right? That is the way to do it, in your opinion, or do you need to be changing the way in which you're campaigning on the broader issues of animal welfare?
Yeah, I think it's a good campaigner has several tools in their toolbox, and sometimes it really helps to create awareness if you need to make people aware. Sometimes it really helps to work on influencing policymakers and with some good and sound research and scientific backups. And I think that is very typical for the organization that I work for Humane World for Animals. Is we're always science-based. We're always looking at okay, what's the evidence here? We're not just shouting and saying, okay, this has to stop without some scientific backup. So. And in other situations, you want to work together with partners. You want to work together with the corporate sector on together deciding on a way forward and say, okay, well, what can we do in the next 5 years and after the next 5 years, and how can we help you to make that transition? So it depends a bit on the situation.
Ruud Tombrock, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Jack.